Hi, welcome to our very first video in the Two Neanderthals project, where we'll be exploring contemporary phenomena and thematics from a specifically psychological perspective. In this video, we'd like to begin by looking specifically at a relatively recent phenomenon, the spate of mass high school shootings that we've experienced here in the United States, and to be looking at that and trying to come to some understanding of what's going on.
It just didn't seem like, well, you and I have discussed this before, when we were kids, high schoolers in the 70s, and it just didn't seem like that was even on the radar for those kinds of things to happen. We still had the news. It's not like we didn't have access to information about happenings across the country. We didn't have instantaneous kinds of news like we have now to tell us everything that's going on everywhere at all times. But if this was a thing in the 70s, it would have been in our conscious awareness. We would have been talking about it. It would have been a subject of discussion. And it just didn't happen. We still had guns. Kids still went hunting after school. And it never even occurred to us to do something like that. So it's kind of a mystery, and hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on it, at least from the perspectives that we approach it with psychology.
Yeah, Mark, it really is startling for people of our generation to look and see what's happening in the culture today, and especially in contrast with what we experienced as teenagers in the 70s. The first actual school shooting occurred at the very end of the 70s in 1979. It was a young woman by the name of Brenda Spencer, I believe. So both Mark and I basically went through our entire adolescence with none of this. It was simply non-existent throughout our experience. And once again, as Mark mentioned, we had a lot of guns. There have always been a lot of guns in American culture. There was a lot of bullying, too. There was like tons of bullying and cruelty and, just plain nastiness, as there always is in high school.
And those things haven't changed. There's still the bullying. There's still the unfairness about the growing up, the awkwardness of adolescence, the woeful shortage of rites of passage, that we have. I think that maybe we had more of back when we were kids. So, well, what is it specifically? What are the specific things that are causing this to happen? Sometimes almost weekly or monthly. That never started until the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah. In the video on my channel, I talked a little bit about this in terms of entitlement. And the idea is that, part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason I think why people of our generation did not shoot up the schools is that we just didn't feel entitled to do so. Like, we didn't get the message that was somehow within the purview of things that we could reasonably do in response to all of the pain and turmoil and torment, really, of adolescence.
Well, I think that speaks to your comment in one of your videos on your channel on the external locus of control that gives us that sense of entitlement, that we could be so have such a strong feeling of entitlement that we can take another life in that kind of a manner as an outlet, as an appropriate outlet for the angst that is felt of being an adolescent and being in that awkward time of life. And I think that another part of it is one thing that fosters that kind of thinking, I think, is the speed of life that we have. The speed of technology, the speed of, and the focus, the outward focus, which I think exacerbates that external locus of control. the technology that we've created for phones and tablets, and it perpetuates that kind of external locus of control.
Yeah, because Mark, I think when we're in a kind of psychological state where we're really dependent upon the external world to provide a sense of fulfillment or a sense of ourselves as being good somehow, when we haven't cultivate our own inner resources in order to deal with the inevitable hardships of life, then when they come around, I think it's much easier for people, especially young people who haven't yet developed themselves, to have the thought that, well, maybe the correct response is mass homicide or something like that. When you develop your inner resources, then I think it makes that a lot more difficult to come to that conclusion because you have other things you can rely upon.
It almost seems like the thought is it's easier to turn outward and to lash outward than it is to turn inward and to be introspective and to foster the kinds of nurturing growth within yourself to become a functional and really integral part of your social circle and the bigger circle of culture generally. And of course, that speaks directly to the way Carl Jung brought up the idea of our shadow. There is a darkness to us, and it's so downplayed and it's so overlooked that and I think that tends to make these kinds of behaviors manifest themselves.
Yeah, so if we were to, let's say, take up the topic of school shootings from a Jungian perspective, and which of course implies dynamics of repression and shadow and those sorts of things, like how would you say that the shadow, conceived culturally, is beginning to play out in terms of school shootings and the sort of will to mass homicide that we see these days? What is being repressed? What are the shadow dynamics there?
Well, I think it's not the shadow per se itself. It is the way we take it up or don't take it up, I should say. The way that we are so encouraged to, for sports, there's such a, and it's been like this even when we were kids, but sports is so predominant in the kids that are marginalized, the artists, the thinkers, the poets, the more gentle souls, maybe I could say, seem to have more of a contact with their inner self, their shadow self, and yet those are the very ones that are left out of the mainstream of athletics and activities and outward expressions of the self.
I can agree with that. At the same time, of course, I tend to see things from an existential perspective, and so for me, it seems that part of the shadow work or the shadow play that's going on has to do with what Rollo May calls an ontological repression. And what that means is the part of what's being systemically repressed, I think, within our culture at this point in history is the deep sense for being alive as a human being. Like we're I think, especially young people, when I say we, but perhaps our culture more generally, is becoming more and more estranged from life, from the deep pulse of life and what life is about, and from the sense that we are, participating in the unfolding of existence, and that there's a kind of sort of value and a kind of nobility and a kind of dignity inherent to that is more or less antithetical to this whole impulse to annihilate life, in essence. That's what school shootings are about, is annihilating life.
That's a good point. An active participant in life. Well, I think it takes both, though. For me, I think it takes this active participation in life, this nourishing of conscious awareness of being alive in the world,
Mm-hmm.
But I think the unconscious is also critical.
Oh yeah.
That's
Yeah.
where my Jungian shows itself.
Yes. Yes.
I think that the unconscious elements of ourself, our dreams, our fantasies, our daydreaming, our all of these things that we discount or downplay as being archaic or extraneous, are very, very critical in giving us a balance toward life, not only with uh, nourishing the outward consciousness of being alive, but with digging in and looking at the other side of us, the unconsciousness of us.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I kind of got this vision of how we are culturally that is like we're so damn intent on trying to be entertained and trying to be happy and everyone being okay all of the time that we can't sort of acknowledge sort of the darker side of things until it's too late, until we're at the point of combustion somehow,
We use these tools that we make to help make our lives easier or whatever. The electronics and the technology, our gadgets, and that tends to come back and bite us in the ass.
Yeah.
What I mean is, we become so preoccupied with the gadgetry and with the interface of it that we lose not only the being in touch with our inwardness, our unconsciousness, but we lose touch with even our conscious awareness of being alive in the world. We're in a room full of people, but we're all alone with our device.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's not only an intoxication with the devices. I think we're really in love with the sensation of intoxication itself. That's what we're really fixated on. I think the devices are just a means for achieving that intoxication.
So it's a new way of getting the dopamine.
Yeah, in a sense. So the intoxication, if we're really in love with the intoxication in the sense of distraction and entertainment and sort of deviation from sort of the deep meaning or pulse of life somehow, then the question becomes, well, what are the dynamics of intoxication? And here we're, I think, almost on the edge of speaking in addictive terms, like looking at Addictions 101, perhaps, for a kind of model for our society. Who knows? Perhaps the manifestations that we see in terms of school shootings are just sort of the bottoming out, as it were, of some people, which is a bottoming out. That's a phrase they use in addictions counseling and rehabilitation and that sort of thing. What that means is that in order for people to get better, a lot of the time they have to really go into the damn swamp and really experience unbelievable hardship, both for themselves and creating it for other people and so on. That it's sort of like the archetypal hero's journey.
Yeah.
Very often heroes, speaking of Jungian archetypes, have to go into the netherworld or the hell realm somehow and endure a kind of awful ordeal. A hell realm dismemberment is how they say it in shamanic language sometimes.
It is kind of a death, but some people never get past that point.
Well, yeah.
There has to be the rebirth that comes from it.
Yes.
And the hero has to come out the other side more self-aware and more alive in the world.
So what would a rebirth, if we were to sort of open the doors of our imagination, what would a rebirth in this particular realm possibly look like?
Well, one thing just off the top of my head would be some kind of intentional rite of passage that we reincorporate into adolescence.
Rite of passage, okay.
A way of making the journey, but not having to make it alone, and not having to have the angst of feeling that there's no other way out except through these pathologies that emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes the best way to do that is in community.
Community, yeah. See, that was my thought that, like, I think maybe what's missing a lot of the time is the genuine sense of accompaniment, which I
Mm.
think, Mark, in our youth, we had more of that because we spent a lot larger fraction of our lives in direct communication with each other, with our parents, and
Well,
whoever was around,
we didn't
rather
have the
than
other
the
distractions.
mediated
Yeah.
type of communication.
Yeah.
So we could feel it and sort of really, like, we're looking at each other in the eyes right now. Like, either you can feel something to
Yeah.
that is, if it's there within a sort of technologically mediated communication, it's there in a very diluted way. And so for me, like, the sort of rebirth, the kind of rebirth that would have to happen, I suspect would have to be a kind of reinvention, maybe that's the right word,
Mm-hmm.
of the deep sense of like the thou saying, like Martin Buber talks about saying thou to each other, which you can say in many different kinds of ways. And in fact, you can say thou to each other in silence, if you're present to each other in the right way. But perhaps that would be a sort of prescription for getting through this.
I think the word that I'm drawn to is a rediscovery.
Hmm.
It's like something that we've forgotten culturally that we need to rediscover. There have been initiatives going back to the 70s. The outward bound movements and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think they may
My son went through outward bound.
Yeah, okay. So
a few
you're
years ago.
personally aware of that kind of the power. Those kinds of initiatives can help pull these kids into community.
Yeah.
And it's not a piecemeal kind of a thing. It's an integrated kind of approach.
Yeah.
But it helps them address not only an outward working together, a being in the world kind of approach, but it's also an inward looking at the not being afraid of the dark parts of ourselves, but an embrace of that.
Yeah.
An awareness and an acknowledgement of that.
See, this is where I think like psychoanalytic thinking really has something very valuable to offer, is a kind of affirmation of contact with darkness, and with the kind of honesty and the kind of courage that it takes to really encounter darkness as it lives and breathes through us as individuals, also collectively across the social terrain. I think, man, that is really missing these days. Like, very infrequently do we allow ourselves to sort of name our demons and give expression to our demons.
And I think, well, just one from like pop culture kind of an example that I can think of that is the T-shirts and the bumper stickers that say "No Fear." Well, to me, that is the worst prescription that you can have. You should be terrified of it, but you should embrace it anyway.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. The no fear stickers, and you know who the person is that has no fear? It's the idiot, because the idiot doesn't know enough to know when it's right to be afraid. Fear is an adaptive reaction to the environment.
So the person, he's idiot, or
well, the person who just doesn't know enough to be afraid. Is the person without fear. That's not the courageous person. The idiot is not the courageous person. The courageous person is the one who feels fear and yet
embraces
moves
it
forward anyhow. Exactly,
And so I think maybe we've circled back around and given some kind of a, maybe not an answer, but at least a pointing in a direction.
A sense of direction, And I think at this point there are no definite answers. All there is if there is an answer, it'll be the product of our ongoing efforts, both individually and collectively, to create and invent a new answer in light of how the world's changing, in light of the fact that technologies are absorbing so much of our energies, and perhaps there's less in vivo contact. But I don't think it's a matter of going back into the past to try to reclaim a past paradigm. It's a matter of, that's not going to work. That's not realistic. I think what it is a matter of inventing actively and being creative about how we are.
I think it's a rediscovering that missing something, but it's doing so in the context of the current situation of the technology and speed of everyday real life.
Yes. So perhaps this is sort of a place to end, not with a
Maybe not with
a
a
bang, but
with a
you
what
know,
if.
yeah. Yes. The sense of direction. I think that's what we're really looking for at this time when we look and see these mass homicides and that sort of thing. Is
Yeah.
and we can't find an answer. There's no easy answer. All the easy answers do not work for one reason or another. I think what we're really looking for is a generalized sense of direction that might eventually yield up an answer, but we don't know.
But we'll pick this and some other things up with you next time, and we appreciate you watching us and listening and giving your time to us.
Yes, thank you very much for accompanying us. Take care.